Well, I just, of course, want to also give my thanks to the Wiradjuri people of this sandstone country for welcoming and being so generous in allowing us to be here. Thank you very much. I did really want to make a point of pointing out that the bones of your country here are sandstone, and the bones of the country I come from, which is Anawan country from up on the Northern Tablelands, are granite. And I've brought a couple of friends from the back paddock to just give me some company here. The first part of this talk I've called Reading the Landscape, and it begins from the premise that you can't really say or think anything meaningful about what's around us until you really observe it carefully, and that's easier said than done. You have to be open to what it has to say about both now and about the past. And I think the most important thing we can do is slow down. Slow down and really consider before we leap in to make any modifications, because we've done a pretty comprehensive thing of stuffing up, and we keep on getting onto all sorts of silver bullets that we think are going to save us, and I think we just need to slow down. And we look around us, we see native bush, trees, other vegetation in tracts that may not be ideal. We need to know, do they currently provide usable corridors for birds and other native creatures, or are they mostly cleared? If they're cleared, how are they cleared? Now we're beginning to have the awareness of the ecological services that are provided by local species, and that has been very slowly, it's only come to very slow acknowledgement. And variations in plant communities, seepage and drainage lines, underlying rocks indicating soil type, all these elements give important information about land history and capacity. But it's crucial to understand that despite all these apparent constants, landscape is essentially dynamic. It's in a state of constant change within very broad parameters. It's a series of interrelated cycles, and certain cycles must be met to keep those, so certain conditions rather must be met to keep those cycles healthy. And as we've heard so beautifully this morning from Bruce, explorers in the very early days marvelled at the soft soils, fertile yam fields and abundant grasslands they encountered on expeditions beyond Sydney town. But within a very few years, these lands had become compacted and unproductive for European-type agricultural enterprises. These had been lands, as we know now, that were consciously managed by Indigenous stewards until they were driven away. In many places, the topsoil had been noted as deep and spongy. This sponginess indicated a lot of humic aggregates. But when new factors are brought into a landscape, such as large mobs of hard-hooved animals where before only intermittently ranging soft-footed ones had been, things start to change. And we know that these changes occurred over a very short amount of time, and earlier explorer accounts of fertility were buried under stories explaining Australia as a geologically old and eroded continent of inherently low agricultural capacity. And white settler accounts of harsh toil for little or no return in an unforgiving environment overtook the national consciousness. Writers like Henry Lawson confirmed the idea that life on the land was a battle against the elements, not a partnership. And standing back and looking at all this from a 21st century viewpoint, it's clear that at least two crucial things happened in the first 100 years of white settlement: drastic disruption of the carbon cycle and drastic disruption of the water cycle. These are interrelated management issues because landscapes are systems of wholly integrated processes. Pushing one out of kilter has a cascading effect. Ideally, when it rains, that rain completely infiltrates the soil onto which it falls, so it becomes available for plants. But if that soil is compacted, bare, or for some reason hydrophobic, the rain will run off carrying eroded soil with it. And the sudden onslaught of huge herds, numbered in their thousands, of both sheep and cattle, had a powerful impact on Australian soils. Not only were there hard hooves, but sheep teeth in particular cropped native grasses almost to the ground. They severed above ground growing points, which are a feature of many native perennials, including the kangaroo grass, which is one of the reasons for its decline. So they declined and they had a considerable inability or a lesser ability to resprout. There are also the unprecedented dietary demands of these new herbivores. Bred over hundreds of years in Europe on very different and younger geologies, sheep and cattle had a higher need for nitrogen, phosphorus and other minerals than Australian soils could supply. Whereas Australian plants and animals had co-evolved to deal with these limitations, the voracious newcomers stripped vegetation in a desperate search for nutrition. All grazing animals are selective with each mouthful, so it wasn't long before the most desirable native grasses were eaten or trampled out and replaced by either bare ground or less nutritious forbs. So began loss of biodiversity and the lessening of biostimulation that biodiversity brings. Now that idea of biostimulation I hope is going to come up again. I think Bruce mentioned it briefly when he talked about the interrelatedness of plants within these yam daisy fields. But this is a feature across all plant communities. So this interactive change begun by settler herds also extended to changes beneath the surface. As minerals were removed in feedstuff and below ground biota changed, the soil began to acidify. There was no longer adequate calcium to maintain a near neutral pH, so some of the major soil nutrients that they'd had chemical access to before were now less accessible by plants. And as the mineral calcium has the physical effect of increasing the number and sizes of pores in soil, loss of calcium meant a decreased potential for both rain and oxygen to infiltrate soil. And when calcium is reduced and acidity increases, the soil crust hardens. This leads to poorer use of available rainfall and increased erosion. And I believe that currently the estimated average rainfall use efficiency across our farmlands is only 21%. And in pre-settler environments, water which entered rivers and creeks tended to filter underground rather than flow overground. In this way, evaporation in the hot Australian sun was reduced and precious water preserved. However, this arrangement did not suit the herders, whose animals required far larger volumes of water than native creatures. Herders excavated the sides of creeks and removed vegetation to increase access. And I think you'll be hearing a great deal more about that when we all go out to Marloo this afternoon and hear what's happening as natural sequence farming attempts to redress some of this. On top of this, with the water cycle and system under which Australian grasslands have evolved catastrophically disrupted, large tracts of native vegetation important to continued healthy maintenance of natives was destroyed to increase croplands and grazing acres. The pathway to continuous formation of humic compounds was reduced. Grasses and other plants were then forced into survival mode by beginning to mine the store of carbon-rich humus sequestered beneath them. In other words, to raid the bank, which had been their buffer for hundreds, if not thousands of years. This is by necessity a pretty simplified overview, but I think we need to understand the general background of the soil problems that we're now faced with and we're trying to fix. And the errors of the past were made in ignorance, but we do have some extremely cluey and farmers and researchers, both, who are now working on solutions. And almost all those solutions involve the harnessing of the third leg of soil, which is biology. It really is all now about biology. For many years, the so-called Green Revolution worked on the physical and chemical aspects of soil and totally neglected biology. Throughout this Green Revolution time, and I'm talking predominantly in the years post-World War II, crop yields certainly increased as farmers had access to fertilisers such as superphosphate, but overall soil health deteriorated as soil microbic life declined, continuing the downhill slide which had begun with white settlement. So now I just want to jump to the carbon cycle, what it is and why it's so important. And as I'm sure you're all aware, carbon is one of the constituents of our atmospheric gases. It's also a major underpinner of the fertility of soils worldwide. While most of the emphasis on carbon capture has been, in Australia anyway, has been on sequestering it in trees, soil has enormous capacity to capture and store carbon at depth for very long periods of time. Dr. Christine Jones, an Australian researcher, preeminent in this field, maintains that the world's soils currently hold about 3 times as much CO2 as the atmosphere and 4 times as much as is held in vegetation, with capacity to, and so that soil has a capacity to sequester a great deal more. Humus is an extremely stable form of soil carbon, so in addition to enhancing nutrient availability for plants and assisting in soil porosity and aeration, carbon-rich humus is intimately connected to water retaining capacity. Low soil moisture and low levels of soil organic carbon go hand in hand. But it's estimated that humus can hold up to 4 times its weight in water, like a giant sponge, slowly releasing it as required, an amazing dry times buffer. Building soil carbon requires green plants and soil microbes, in particular a fungi known as arbuscular mycorrhiza. Dr. Jones posits a system she calls year-long green farming in order to maximise this process. The fundamental is photosynthesis, which takes place in the chloroplasts of all green leaves. Imagine these leaves as solar panels, drinking in sunlight energy, then chemically transforming it to a form of glucose using CO2 from the air and water from the soil. The glucose is then resynthesised into a wide variety of carbon compounds. A percentage of these is taken down into the roots and exchanged with soil microbes. These microbes feed on the carbon compounds and in return provide the plant with minerals mined from inorganic rock particles, helping to provide the mineral density so crucial for any animals, including humans, that eventually eat those plants. The more green leaves a plant has, the more roots there are, and the more carbon is bridged to microbes in that symbiotic process. And the final stage in building soil carbon is humification. In this process, soil microbes resynthesise and polymerise labile carbon exuded from plant roots into high molecular weight humic substances. These are gel-like and bind to form an integral component of the soil mix. Importantly, humification cannot proceed unless there is a continuous supply of fuel for soil microbes. That is, there must be a continuous supply of green leaves to perform continuous photosynthesis. If this stops, carbon exuded from roots simply oxidises and is recycled back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Under some circumstances, soils may be bacterially dominated, that is, plants growing from them form mutually beneficial relationships with bacteria rather than fungi. Examples are our common vegetables and annual grasses. Annual grasses, so this is the importance. You've heard these things mentioned time and again. Perennials, perennials, perennials. They're so important. Bacterially dominated, bacterially colonised plants don't form the same organic compounds as mycorrhizas actually associate with 85% of the world's plants. So these are the soil biota that are extremely sensitive to tillage or to the application of fertilisers such as phosphorus or nitrogen. But in themselves, they increase the health and nutrient density of the plants with which they symbiotically associate. So I hope you can start to see how this whole picture all integrates with some of the things that, well, along all of the things really that Bruce was talking about this morning. He's just looking at it from a different angle. It was a pretty good system that the original inhabitants of this this continent had in place. The next speaker, I think, is going to be talking about cropping, so I won't say anything about that. But I do, in these last few minutes, just want to mention a grazing system that, because I don't think anyone is today talking about grazing systems, but they're talking about a grazing system that has had incredibly great or growing influence here in Australia as well as in the United States. It's connected with the ideas behind Dr. Jones's year-long green farming. It is essentially a biological system which builds on the beneficial accumulation of humus through controlling the movement of pastured animals such as sheep, cattle, goats or horses across the landscape. It's variously called holistic grazing, cell grazing or managed grazing. Its principles are simple, but in practice require an excellent knowledge of local pasture plants and the patience to observe and monitor their growth across all seasons. Also required is capital, as there is a good deal of necessary infrastructure. The ideas behind managed grazing supposedly developed in South Africa from observation of the way game herds moved across unfenced terrain, snatching mouths full of feed as they go, in constant transit from one place to the next. This prevents desirable fodder species from being eaten out, while still bringing in enough ground disturbance and a scattering of dung to stimulate new generations. In a farm context, rather than having no fences, managed grazing requires a lot of fences enclosing lots of small paddocks, each with an off-stream watering point. Animals are moved from one paddock to the next frequently, depending on pasture growth rates with the seasons. At high growth times, they may be moved daily, so grasses are never cropped so low that recovery through rapid photosynthesis is inhibited. The results of properly implemented managed grazing are very positive. Not only does profitability increase for the grazier, as the frequently rested land can carry more stock, animal health also improves. There's increased biodiversity in pasture species and the associated vigour that comes with the all-important biostimulation. Carbon sequestration also speeds up with maximised mycorrhizal hyphae, and the increased humus results in more moisture held in the soil bank for dry times. Because stock move on before they get bored and start browsing the regenerating native shrubs and trees, these also tend to flourish, bringing back native birds and other system beneficials. A research undertaken recently indicates that 30% tree cover in each paddock gives quantifiable economic gain to the grazier in terms of shelter for lambing and calving and protection of the soft grasses from both heat and frost. And if it sounds like I'm trying to sell something with this glowing report on managed grazing, I can assure you all I've said is actually backed up by research and experience over more than 20 years. But the really important thing is it must be properly implemented, and it does take a lot of effort. So here we are in 2016, beginning to embark on the journey towards regenerating the Australian landscape we so badly hurt when we threw ourselves unthinkingly upon it 200 years ago, believing it had infinite capacity. There is certainly some reason for optimism, but I just would like to suggest that we go more slowly and thoughtfully. And we need to understand that a very great deal of regeneration has to take place before we can even begin to talk about sustainability. Regeneration is all.